so much. Good evening, all of you. I, Dr. Manju Zaibai, welcome all of you on behalf of IIP Raigad and SRCC Children Hospital for today's very interesting webinar. I welcome our respected President, IIP Raigad, Dr. Sunita Ingle ma'am, our senior member, Dr. Gangolia sir, and all the members of IIP Raigad as well as our friends from SRCC Children's Hospital. And now I request Sunita Ingle ma'am to say a few words.
Thank you, Manju. So, good evening all. A warm welcome to all on behalf of IIP Raigad. I welcome our distinguished speakers, Dr. Naresh Biyani sir and Dr. Vibhor Borkar sir to this webinar. I also welcome SRCC coordinator, Mr. Manmohan and Mr. Mahesh is here. I welcome our respected seniors, Dr. Dabadkar sir, Dr. Gangolia sir, and Dr. Niman Mohanty sir is here today, and Dr. Nilima, Manju, Dr. Neha, Sonali, and all of you. Okay, I must appreciate and thank SRCC Children's Hospital, which is managed by Narayana Health, for coordinating and arranging this webinar for us. I think this is our second webinar. The first one was really greatly appreciated. And there will be two topics, two speakers today, two sessions back to back, and I will request everyone to ask questions at the end of the session so that we can finish on time. And also I will request everyone to mute their audio and also the video. But before I go, I see Dr. Dabadkar sir has joined despite having connectivity issues. Sir, welcome, sir. Okay. Over to Dr. Gangolia sir, you want to say a few words? Dr. Dabadkar
all the
sir.
best. All the best.
Thank you so much, sir. Dr. Dabadkar sir.
So, good evening, everybody. Just today, I talked with our beloved President, Dr. Sunita Ingle, that I am now getting depressed because I cannot meet everybody. And probably this is the only way that I can meet few of my very good friends. Madam, please accept my compliments that you are doing extremely good work for Raigad IIP. You and you, all your team, please accept my compliments. And it will be my pleasure to listen all qualified faculties for this seminar. I don't know how long this internet will work with me. I have joined from my mobile, but I wish you best luck to everybody. Thank you very much, madam, for mentioning my name. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Dr. Mohanty, sir. Okay, I think you all must be, sir is not responding. So over to Manju for the introduction of the first speaker. We start our sessions.
Yes. Actually, we are very.
Nilima? Yes.
Chitra madam has joined.
Okay. Welcome, Chitra.
Hi.
Over to Manju.
Yes, ma'am. We are actually very fortunate to have two distinguished speakers today who are masters in their respective field. First topic for today's webinar is recent advances in brain tumors in children. And to talk on that, I invite respected Dr. Naresh Biyani sir. Sir has done MBBS from Mysore and he has done MCH from Mumbai University. Followed by that, he has done fellowship in pediatric neurosurgery from Israel as well as from UK and from USA. He has various publications. He has great experience in neuroendoscopy, hydrocephalus, congenital anomalies, craniofacial surgeries, pediatric neuroendocrinology, spinal cord tumor, trauma, epilepsy surgery, etc. He has numerous publications in various national as well as international journals and books. So I'm feeling very honored to introduce such a learned person, and I'm sure today's his talk will be an academic treat for all the listeners. So over to you, sir. Dr. Naresh Biyani, sir, can you hear?
Thank you very much. IIP Raigad is my home ground actually. Okay, it's a home for us. Let me just start sharing my screen. Is the screen visible now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So let us start. We'll not waste time. Thank you, SRCC and IIP Raigad branch to have this interactive session. For next 20 minutes, what we are going to discuss is the various common presentation in pediatric brain tumor. Protocol-wise management, where surgery is important, where radiotherapy takes over, where chemotherapy is taking the lead, and also what are the last decade, what are the recent advances, and how we have changed the life of children. This is what we are going to discuss today. First case is a 1-year-old child has a squint since 15 days, has been seen by an ophthalmologist, and then there is a bilateral sixth nerve, and the fundoscopy shows papilledema. There is no headache, there is no vomiting. Immediately the ophthalmologist got an MRI done, and MRI shows this type of picture actually. So this is a large posterior fossa tumor causing secondary hydrocephalus, and it is cystic and solid in component. And this is how the child would present to a pediatrician. And as a pediatrician, everybody is worried, 1-year-old with a large posterior fossa mass, what would be the prognosis? So this is a pilocytic astrocytoma. That is the second commonest brain tumor in children. Posterior fossa is the most commonest place for brain tumor in children, and this is the second most commonest in the posterior fossa. And this pilocytic astrocytoma is a very, very low-grade tumor. Has a very good prognosis. Only surgery is recommended. There is no role of radiotherapy or chemotherapy. In fact, radiation would give malignant transformation. So radiation is contraindicated in a known pilocytic astrocytoma. It has a very good prognosis. I'll put a second case. 18 months child comes with vomiting, irritability, walking hand, falling down. It's the scan.
बाकी बातें बाद में भी हो सकती हैं।
The posterior as well.
Hello, I will request everybody to mute themselves, please. Please mute themselves. Yes, yes, sir. Continue.
There's a big posterior fossa occupying all of the posterior fossa tumor, posterior fossa compartment, and causing hydrocephalus. So how do we go about it, and what would be the diagnosis? So the diagnosis is medulloblastoma, and this is the most commonest brain tumor and posterior fossa tumor in the children. And it's the most malignant brain tumor as well, but has a very good prognosis. Why? Because it responds very well to chemotherapy and radiation. So the role of surgery. Hello. So the role of surgery here is to have a maximum safe debulking and removal of the tumor, get the tumor for immunohistochemistry and histopathological diagnosis, and CSF diversion. That's it. The third child, 2-year-old child, had a torticollis that is in the recent onset since 1 month. Had been to an ENT surgeon, local massage and everything was given. He couldn't find anything abnormal. And now she started with vomiting and headache. So a CT scan was asked for. Again, there is a posterior fossa SOL here. And the tumor is coming out of foramen of Luschka. And when they come out of foramen of Luschka, that is where they irritate the lower Killian nerve and presents with the torticollis. And again, one more common thing that we see in the posterior fossa tumor like this is that it comes down. The diagnosis is ependymoma. Okay. Now this is not so good tumor. This is a third common tumor.
बिहारी सर 1 मिनट
हाँ
मोहंती सर प्लीज जरा म्यूट कीजिए मोहंती सर go ahead please.
Yeah, it's a potentially malignant tumor because even if it is grade 1 or grade 2, it behaves like a malignant tumor and is not having that good prognosis. Surgery remains the mode of treatment. Radiation is given in partial excision, but it is not effective. And also there is no role of chemotherapy in this type of tumors. Case number 5, the Pranshu, 30-month-old child, presented with 6 months of lower facial nerve palsy, LML type of facial palsy. So it was treated as a Bell's palsy, given steroid, but usually in Bell's palsy it recovers. And in our child, the thing doesn't recover. So that is when the pediatrician thought of getting an MRI done. And the MRI shows that there is a pontine SOL that is localized and protruding into the fourth ventricle. No attended hydrocephalus. Extending into the medulla. This is the pons, and it's coming right up to the medulla, to the respiratory center. Okay, and most of it was exophytic in nature and was into the fourth ventricle. That is why it's being great. So the diagnosis here is again, this is a post-op scan after the resection, where near total resection was done. From here, the cavity is there. And again, it's a pilocytic astrocytoma. Has a very good prognosis again. It's an uncommon brainstem tumor, but since it's a low-grade tumor, has a very good prognosis if it is surgically safely excisable. Now, the second most commonest tumor that is so now
Hello, may I request everybody to mute themselves, please? Yes, sir.
okay. So this is a 6-year-old child who had a central diabetes insipidus. She was peeing a lot. There was severe loss of weight. At 6 years, she was just 13 kilos. So this is a diencephalic syndrome. Okay, and the scan was done by a pediatric endocrinologist. That showed there is a mass in the suprasellar region. Okay, this is a mass. This is a plain CT MRI, and on giving the contrast, it is enhancing brilliant. Okay. When we see the suprasellar and the pineal SOL, we like to do the tumor markers, that is alpha fetoprotein and beta SCG, to see the germ cell origin tumor. Alpha fetoprotein would be high in the yolk sac tumor, and beta SCG would be high in the but most commonest tumors that we see, germinoma, is not produces these enzymes very high, So we waited. When we are working up, she developed acute hydrocephalus, and we used the ventricle as a corridor to take the biopsy. Okay, so the biopsy was done. It turned out to be a round cell tumor, germinoma, and first cycle of chemotherapy, one single cycle, the tumor melts off actually. Now, this is the latest advancement in the neuro-oncology, where you suppose you see a brain tumor, it need not be totally excised. What we just want is the diagnosis, and if it is a chemosensitive tumor, there is no need of doing a major morbid surgery as well. So she completed 6 cycles of chemotherapy, and after first cycle, her diabetes insipidus also resolved by itself. Germinoma. So it's a most common germ cell tumor. It's very malignant, but has very good prognosis. The reason is that it is nicely and very sensitive to chemotherapy and also radiotherapy. So the role of surgery is just to have a histopathological diagnosis and CSF diversion if the hydrocephalus is there. Shreyas, 7-year-old child, has come with severe headache and vomiting, no neurological deficit. You see there is a lesion in the sitting in the third ventricle, causing hydrocephalus. Okay. Again, we go by the same thing. We get the tumor markers done, hormonal profile done, pituitary axis done, visual axis, and then endoscopic biopsy is done. Endoscopic biopsy is a mixed germ cell tumor, where there are germ cell tumor cells and non-germ cell tumor cells. Chemotherapy was it resolved with just chemotherapy. They also respond very well to radiation also. The 12-year-old child came with Peyronie's syndrome, convergence and upward gait restrictions. There's a lesion sitting in the pineal place without any hydrocephalus. The most commonest tumor that we see in the pineal region is pinealoblastoma. Now, all these blastomas are termed into a round cell tumor and PNAT group of tumor, primitive neuroectodermal tumor, so that the stratification of the tumor is possible. And we know that they respond very well to chemotherapy. So the biopsy was done, and biopsy revealed that was a pineal as well. Now, one thing that I want to bring to your attention is that radiation cannot be given less than 3 years of age. Actually, suppose you have a child who is 2.5 years old, they diagnosed with a PNET tumor, then they will receive a chemotherapy. Finish the chemotherapy. After 3 years, radiation is given. This is to prevent the harmful effect on the growth of the craniospinal axis and pituitary. And this is after the surgery and the treatment. You see a residual contrast enhancement lesion, but the tumor is not there. So now here in a PNET, like medulloblastoma and pinealoblastoma, we are talking about 10-year survival of 70%. That's one of the best survival in any malignancy given, except lymphoma and leukemia actually. So we are talking about a very good prognosis in these particular children. Case number 9, 10-year-old child comes with imbalance in walking, headache, and papilledema. Okay, so this is a FLAIR imaging where you can see the ventricles are dilated, and in the FLAIR you see a lesion in the tectal plate, and that is what is causing hydrocephalus, and is presenting with the normal pressure hydrocephalus type of a picture with the imbalanced gait. Okay, here we don't have to, if the tectal glioma comes radiologically, then there is no need of doing a biopsy also. What we would do is the endoscopic third ventriculostomy, relieve the hydrocephalus, and this tumor remains stable for decades together. So again, a major surgery can be avoided by knowing what is the best treatment to be followed. They are low-grade tumors, and absolutely no role of resection surgeries at all. ETV or a VP shunt is done to relieve the hydrocephalus. Again, there is no role of chemotherapy and radiation. 8-year-old child comes with absent seizures, slightly aggressive behavior that the family has noticed in last 15 days. EEG is normal and no neurological deficit. That is when the pediatric neurologist thought of getting a MRI done. And MRI reveals the white enhancing part that you are seeing here is occupying one of the sulcus of the temporal lobe actually. Now again, FLAIR images, is best images. Any abnormality in the brain would be nicely picked up in the FLAIR images. So you see a localized lesion arising from the superior temporal gyrus and is causing convulsion. So radiologically, and it doesn't enhance the contrast. So radiologically, this is DNET. This is the intra-op ultrasound that we did in the surgery. This embryoblastic neuroectodermal tumor, DNET, and again, it is having very good prognosis. It's very low-grade tumor. Even if subtotal resections are done, still they become convulsion-free. Surgery remains the mainstay of the treatment. There is no role of radiation or chemotherapy. Manishka, she's a 9-year-old girl, comes with headache. She was tested malarial positive. So anti-malarial treatment was given. But headache still persisted, and that were unexplained clinically due to malaria. That is when a CT scan was done. And then the CT scan showed a large thalamic as well, causing hydrocephalus and midline shift. MRI was asked for. And again, you see the MRI, there's a right in the thalamus sitting there. On contrast enhancement, now this is the irregularly enhancing necrotic tumor and having daughter metastasis, daughter tumors as well. So radiologically, this is a glioblastoma multiforme. Again, how do we diagnose? Somebody would say that it can be a tuberculoma. So we do a MR spectroscopy where the choline peaks are high and lactate peaks are low in a neuroplastic etiology. And if it is a tuberculoma, the lactate peaks are high. So non-invasively, we know that now this is a tumor. Navigation guided, this is the neuronavigation that we do. The frameless stereotactic biopsy that we do. Exact location is taken care. And what we do is that when we are doing a biopsy, to target the contrast enhancement lesion, not in the center of the tumor, that can be a necrotic tissue as well. So the biopsy is done in 3 planes. The target is selected. and a simple Burrow-Lamb biopsy is done. It turned out to be a glioblastoma multiforme. It is one of the very malignant brain tumor and not so good prognosis. Now the role of surgery is here to have a safe debulking and biopsy. The child is subjected to radiation and also chemotherapy that is very soft actually, temozolomide. Case number 12 is a 5-year-old child presents with lethargy, sleepiness. The child was hypothyroid, no vomiting, no visual disturbances. Was corrected with the thyroid, but still his lethargy persisted. That is when the MRI was asked for. And here you see a gross hydrocephalus and a big cystic lesion in the suprasellar region, causing hydrocephalus. And because it is compressing severely the pituitary gland and the hypothalamic hypophysis, it causes the pituitary dysfunction as well. The diagnosis is craniopharyngioma, and in craniopharyngioma we like to do a CT scan where we can see the peripherally enhancing calcium. If you see a calcium peripheral enhancement in the CT scan, it is pathognomonic of craniopharyngioma. This is the machine oil that being drained from the cyst, and then the tumor is excised. Another child. This is a 7-year-old child, and this is how most of the craniopharyngioma presents. Severe loss of vision in the right eye, left eye, and restricted vision in the right eye. And children, they would not be diagnosed also, till the time they are severely hampered. No headache, no vomiting. And you see here is a big lesion, multi-compartmental, multi-cystic, getting into the temporal region, into the posterior fossa, and also in the base. And we can see the calcium also. Again, surgery is done and subtotal resection is done, preserving the pituitary axis. Okay, so this tumor are benign, but their location makes them and the behavior makes them to look like malignant. Why we call them as malignant is because they have a pseudopodia that infiltrates into the hypothalamus, and a lot of neurosurgeons have tried to be radically resective for this lesion and land up developing the hypothalamus, and the child doesn't come out of the surgery as well. So the role of surgery is safe decompression and excision. And if there is a hydrocephalus, then it needs a CSF diagnosis. Case number 14, 27-month-old male has presented with vomiting. The total counts were 11. So an appendectomy was done. The vomiting still persisted. That is when the family thought of changing the pediatrician. The first thing that the pediatrician did was to do a fundoscopic examination. They saw that there is a severe papilledema, and immediately an MRI was asked for. And you can see, there's a big frontal as well. Okay, what would be the prognosis? Was in midline shift and a 27-month-old child. Now, this tumor was resected totally and turned out to be a low-grade ependymoma. And since it's a total resection, it has a very good prognosis. There was no need of any adjuvant radiation or chemotherapy as well. If there is a partial excision, then radiotherapy is subjected. This is a 6-year-old child, comes with bilateral 6-nerve palsy, right 7-nerve palsy, no headache, no neurocutaneous marker. The moment when we see this multiple craniopathy, the thing that should strike us is the brainstem lesions. And this is what the child turned out to be. CT scan shows that there is a hypodensity in the whole of the pons. MRI was asked for. Again, these are the FLAIR images. If anybody would ask you, that what one image that you want to see, just ask them to send you the FLAIR images. Because FLAIR images would get you all the abnormal things very fast. Okay, the whole brainstem is enhanced and is expanded, and this is the basilar artery. Now, in this type of lesion, this we call as diffuse pontine glioma, DIPGs, where even we have stopped doing the biopsy. This diagnosis is on radiology, and the child is subjected to radiation. the prognosis is not good. It's almost like a death certificate to the child. Most of them, they don't survive more than 6 months. Actually, they develop lower canal palsy, and ultimately they aspirate and die. Diffuse spontaneous glioma, not so good prognosis. Actually. The commonest brainstem tumor that we see, but again, brainstem tumor are also very rare. Absolutely no role of surgery. Diagnosis is by just neuroimaging. Palliative radiation is given, but the prognosis doesn't improve. 5-year-old male presented with torticollis since 1 month. Neck massage and all those therapies were given. The torticollis was progressing. Now the child started vomiting. The frontal was tense. That is when the CT scan was done. Now again, we see there's a large tumor in the posterior fossa coming out of the Luschka. And when the MRI was done, this tumor is coming right into the spinal cord also. And this is the basilar artery that is encasing. In a 5-month-old child with such malignant tumor, it's usually ATRT, atypical rhabdoid teratoid tumor, and has a very bad prognosis. Again, in spite of chemotherapy, also there are hardly any survivors. Maybe 2 or 3 survivors in whole world. So again, this is a very bad tumor. Role of surgery is just to do a decompression or get a biopsy, or as a palliative, we put in a shunt. So whatever life the child has, that goes peaceful. No role of radiation if it is less than 3 years old. Mansi is a 7-month-old child, irritable, headache, vomiting, large head, no neurocutaneous marker. So this is the large head, and you can see a lesion, that is in the 3rd ventricle, causing hydrocephalus. And this enhancement, frond-like appearance and enhancement, brilliantly enhancing the contrast, is typical of a choroid plexus papilloma. Okay, this is a very vascular tumor, and during surgery we have to be very, very careful. Now, choroid plexus tumor is one entity where you see the hydrocephalus because of increased production of CSF. As of all the hydrocephalus that we see is always mismatch in the absorption and production. In this, there is a increased production. So, moment you remove the tumor, there is no need to treat the hydrocephalus also. Choroid plexus papilloma, they are very benign tumor, low grade tumor, good prognosis, and surgery remains the mainstay of the treatment. Last case, 8-year-old child on 3 anticonvulsants, no headache, no vomiting, and this is the neurocutaneous markers. Any guess?
Tuberous sclerosis.
Correct, absolutely. This is a tuberous sclerosis, and these are the small nodules that we see, subependymal nodules. These are cortical tubules, and one of the cortical nodule, near the foramen magnum, that increases in size, and it is now named as SEGA, subependymal giant cell astrocytoma. Again, a benign tumor, and amenable to the surgical treatment. Now, there is an experimental ripamycin, the rifampicin ka ही precursor hai, that is used as a tumor static drug. It doesn't make the tumor disappear, but it is just a tumor static. This will jump. So take home messages, Now, I presented you almost like 20 cases actually. So every tumor has a different biology. That we need to understand. Apples are apples, oranges are oranges. Just because one child had a benign tumor doesn't mean that the other child would have a different tumor. So we need to be very, very important about that. Second thing is that now we have a better outcome actually. What has changed over a period of last decade or so, So now we have an MRI and early diagnosis. Second is that operating microscope has revolutionized the neurosurgical outcome actually. All these tumors that we do with the microscope. and magnification, and we try to cause less damage to the normal vital brain structure. Neuronavigation, again, it helps us in just like a Google map, where it has helped us in the navigating through the road. We have a neuronavigation where a mini craniotomy is done and appropriate resection is being done. Better anesthesia techniques and management. Again, it has changed. Maybe when we were doing the residency, we would have heard, if a brain tumor is done, the child is intubated and kept in the PICU. Now, most of our patients are extubated on table. That's because of the good anesthesia techniques and better pediatric intensive care unit. And most important is now is the awareness. More and more pediatricians are aware of this type of tumors, and now they can refer appropriately. What happens now usually is that the moment the brain tumor is diagnosed, and because of our past bad experiences, we even don't give a second chance to the child. We would not refer them to an appropriate specialist. We say, "Arey, kharab hai, tumor hai, jane do na, marne do na, kai ko surgery kara." And that attitude is changing with this awareness programs. Okay. Now, prognostic wise, now we divide these tumors into 3 categories. One is a low-grade tumor like pilocytic astrocyte tumor, choroiditis tumor, or DNET, where they are very, very low-grade tumor and surgery is excised appropriately, completely. Then we are talking about the cure, 100% cure. Now, the second spectrum that we see in the children is again very high-grade tumor, round cell tumors, PNAT, germinomas. Again, they respond very well to adjuvant chemotherapy and radiation. So again, we are talking about a very good cure, very good. And multidisciplinary approach is what has changed the whole thing, for the treatment of this brain tumors in children. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful audio-visual presentation. We will take question and answers at the end of both sessions together. Now I invite Dr. Vibhor Borkar, sir, to talk on second topic of today's webinar, that is liver function test in children.
Hello. Acha, she's back. Hello.
Yes. Sorry for interruption. There is some network issue. So I again invite Dr. Vibhor Borkar, sir, to talk on today's second topic, that is liver function test in children, interpretation and use in clinical scenarios. Dr. Borkar, sir, is very well known to all IIP, Raipur IIPs. He did his MD Pediatrics from PGI Chandigarh and DM Pediatric Gastroenterology from Lucknow. He has various paper presentations and review articles. Also, he has authored national guidelines and book chapters in pediatric gastroenterology. Currently, he is working. Hello. Hello.
We can hear you now.
Manju, continue.
Ma'am, there is a bit network issue. I've joined to another. Currently, Dr. Vibhor Borkar, sir, is working as a senior consultant pediatric gastroenterologist, hepatologist, and liver transplant physician at SRCC Children Hospital, as well as Lokmanya Tilak Medical College. So over to you, sir.
Thank you for giving me opportunity to interact with all of you. And after this wonderful session on basically an exciting neurosurgery and high-tech all surgical techniques, we are coming back to very basics of my specialty, that is liver function test and its interpretation. We commonly do prescribe or basically ask patients for a liver function test. Let's see the details of it, like how to use them in a clinical practice. So the liver function test that we talk about, actually the liver has various functions. It's basically a hub of all metabolic cycles and the biochemical reactions in the entire body for what are the digestion and the other metabolism. So it has various functions. Almost 500 functions are the liver that carry in our body. It can be basically classified as a synthetic function, metabolic test. So all what we actually say that we are saying a liver function test, we are not actually doing any liver function test when we are routinely ordering for that. So basically it's a misnomer. What we actually see is a liver injury test. However, the nomenclature remains continue to be the same. And and there is no single function basically that can measure the single test that can measure the function of the liver. So we always use a battery of tests to see what kind of liver injury a particular individual has. So that's how liver function tests are. Now the liver function test basically, as just we discussed, it tells us about whether the liver is normal or there is a ongoing injury to the liver. Second, depending on how they are basically altered, we can know what is the pattern of a liver disease. Also, serial liver function test can tell us about the severity and the progression of the liver disease, whether it's improving or deteriorating. And once suppose we have any treatable etiology that can tell us about the response to the therapy. However, liver function test has many limitations. As just mentioned, that not single test can tell you about the total functional capacity of the liver. What we test are basically actually a few functions among the thousand of the tests that has been performed by liver, and it lacks sensitivity and specificity. And always has to be done in a clinical context. So if somebody just sending you on basically on email or WhatsApp liver function test reports and asking you, okay, what's wrong? We may say, okay, it's normal, abnormal. But coming to a diagnosis, it's very difficult by just seeing a report. So all the liver function tests that we routinely do, we can broadly classify them as basically some tests that can tell us about the direct inflammation or liver injury. That is SGOT and SGPT, or that we call as AST and ALT, and sometimes LDH. Then test of detection of impaired bile flow that we call as cholestasis. Alkaline phosphatase and GGT tells us about the cholestasis part. Then about the synthetic capacity, INR, prothrombin, and albumin tells about the synthetic function of the liver. Similarly, the excretory function that tells that is we can basically predict by saying how nicely the bilirubin is cleared, and sometimes even the bile salts, which is can be done occasionally. And some tests for all metabolic functions, like in a sick patient or in a failure patient, we do ammonia. So the standard battery of tests that we use is basically bilirubin, that is total and conjugated, total protein and albumin for synthetic function, SGOT, SGPT to look for any liver injury, and alkaline phosphatase and GGT for cholestasis. That's how basically it is a standard battery of tests we do. Now let's have a broad overview of aminotransferase. We know they are now, initially they were called SGOT and SGPT. Now they are called as AST, means aspartate aminotransferase, and alanine aminotransferase, that is ALT. So now they are very sensitive for liver cell injury. Because AST is from cytosol and mitochondria of an hepatocyte. However, they are there in various organs apart from liver, like muscle, kidney, bone, placenta, pancreas. That's why it's not very specific, though sensitive. So it can be elevated in any other systemic myositis, even in hemolysis also. But SGOT, that is ALT, which is mainly in the liver, and so that's why it is for ALT or SGPT in boys and girls are 25 and 22 respectively. So now let's see like how bad. Yeah, am I audible? Hello.
Yes.
Hello. You're audible, but
Voice is
sometimes the
breaking.
voice is breaking. So you can shut off your video if you want. You close the video and audio will be good. Okay then.
Okay. let's see. So if your LFT derangement are mild, means you are getting up to 150 times SGOT is more than SGPT. So in that we generally are dealing with the Wilson disease, mitochondrial diseases, or any underlying intake. We can also suspect non-hepatic causes of elevation like strenuous exercises, myopathies, dystrophies, and hypothyroidism. Even in myopathies and dystrophies also SGPT can go up, but here SGOT will be more than SGOT. It's not like that SGPT elevation is there, means there is no there is or associated liver involved like that. In if we are getting a mild elevation, SGPT is more than SGOT. Think of disease like autoimmune hepatitis, hepatitis, toxin, steatohepatitis, and even the celiac disease. So if we are getting suppose your SGPT is more than SGOT, so we think of acute viral hepatitis, autoimmune hepatitis, ischemic hepatitis, more common in like associated dengue shock syndrome or in the intracardiac repair. So it's very common to be very high. Similarly, medication or toxin-induced liver damage or hyperacute Burkieri syndrome, or sometimes the hepatic artery.
I think there is a big network issue.
Sir has lost the connectivity. We'll just wait.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
Yes.
yes.
Sir
yes.
is not audible.
Yes,
Hello.
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Connectivity in between. Audible now?
The voice is breaking, sir.
Okay, now.
First, share the screen, sir. Share the
I have
screen,
shared
sir.
screen.
Screen has gone.
Shared the screen.
No. Yes. It's
I'm
coming.
sharing the screen
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. The screen is.
I think there is a bit delay.
Yeah.
So now when we are getting SGOT more than SGPT and you have enzymes in thousands, then we think of rhabdomyolysis or sometimes medication or toxins or even in acute alcohol toxicity that we can get in. But when we are getting combination of rapid AST-ALT fall, associated rise in bilirubin and increase in INR, then we think of poor prognosis. If your AST-ALT are falling, it can be improvement also. But it has to be associated with the increased bilirubin, increased INR and encephalopathy. Then we said, okay, there is a probably poor prognosis. Now coming to the alkaline phosphatase, we know it's more located in the canalicular membrane of hepatocytes, bones, enterocytes. So it's elevated in a whenever there is a disease which is involving bile ducts and bile canaliculi. However, it is not very specific. It's a non-specific. It can be involved in any other diseases also. Sometimes we get very low level of alkaline phosphatase. At that time, we think of any malnutrition and zinc deficiency like acrodermatitis enteropathica, severe malnutrition, and even the fulminant Wilson disease. Okay. Now, more of interest for pediatric population is gamma glutaryl transferase (GGT). Generally, it's located in the liver. However, it is not. It is also not very specific, but it is not located into the bone. So when we are dealing with premature babies or adolescent children, so GGT becomes more specific to interpret liver injury compared to alkaline phosphatase. In early or in a younger age, the levels of GGT are high. It can go up to basically first 2 to 3 months, it can go up to 200. However, gradually they come down, and by the end of 1 to 1.5 years, they match the level of around 40. However, certain medics like phenobarbital, you can see that in neonatal cholestasis, many times the phenobarbital is down and GGT goes up. So that is sometimes, and then we may suspect, okay, are we the infection like biliary atresia? Sometimes can be a drug-induced elevation of GGT. So you have to interpret function test, seeing all the these aspects that can cause alteration in the individual aspect of a liver function test. Sometimes we can get a low or normal GGT in certain diseases like progressive familial intrahepatic cholestasis and bile acid synthetic disorders. Now the PFIC is quite commonly recognized in India because of availability of genome studies. So when we are in children, should always use a combination of alkaline phosphatase and GGT that gives us the maximum information. Now coming to the bilirubin, you know that bilirubin is an end product of a hemoglobin degradation. It is taken up by liver and then it is conjugated with the help of UGT1A1 and then excreted through the excretory pumps in the biliary canaliculi. A major part is basically recirculated by enterohepatic circulation and some part is excreted in the feces. There are various methods. Most common method that is done by diazo method, and it is not very accurate, specifically when the bilirubin is less than 5. So that's why when bilirubin is less than 5, many times there is unconjugated hyperbilirubin and we get the conjugated one. So do it from the good labs where the fractionation is done adequately in such scenarios. Now, bilirubin does have a prognostic value. It has been a part of many prognostic scores, like a PELD score, which we use for liver function in children less than 12 years. Similarly, MELD score that we use in the children more than 12 years and adults. Again, King's score criteria for acute failure, Wilson index score, they are all use a bilirubin, but that is always in combination of other labs. Only bilirubin sometimes can be elevated in cholestasis and it can be benign also. It may not be in that liver is so bilirubin elevation may give us all information. Battery of it. Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So another is an albumin. So it has basically a long half-life of 20 days. It's a good marker of synthetic function of the liver. But it's not that useful when you are dealing with the acute injury. So it tells us more about the chronic injury or acute injury, which is going on for at least 7 to 10 days duration. Then measure of coagulation like INR, which measures the extrinsic pathway of coagulation, where the prothrombin is like factor 2 is converted to the thrombin. So all these components of this cascade, they are mostly liver based one. So whenever liver gets deranged, where INR does get affected, so this abnormal, so this tells us about the acute deterioration in the liver function. So whenever you're thinking that liver injury is significant, iron would be a part of our liver function test. Apart from, so why does the liver, in liver disease, the INR can get changed? One thing is because of the decreased synthesis of factor 5, 7, 9, 10, 11, prothrombin, fibrinogen. Of sometimes can be vitamin A deficiency. So we give vitamin and it's getting corrected or not. If stores are less and function is good, only then INR will get corrected. So single dose of vitamin K, maybe around 5 mg in younger kids, neonates 1 mg, older kids more than 5 years, maybe 10 mg. A single dose is sufficient to take care of any deficiency. So repeat INR in 6 months. So there is no need to wait for 3 days to see whether your vitamin K is acted or not. 12 hours are sufficient to come to that conclusion whether synthetic function are bad or there is a deficiency of vitamin K. Then dysfibrinogenemia can be also cause increased INR, DIC. Sometimes there can be enhanced fibrinolysis in a liver base. So 30% of liver-based coagulopathies have a fibrinolysis. And sometimes there can be an add-on thrombocytopenia due to hypersplenism. So liver has a large reserve. So, and this INR has a very good prognostic value in both acute and chronic liver diseases. And that's why again, INR has consistently secured its place in various prognostic scores. Now let's see how to interpret liver function test. So as I mentioned, it should be always interpreted in a clinical context. So when we are basically dealing with any liver disease, so we try to basically divide this injury pattern into three main types. One is, am I dealing with a cholestatic disease? Means there is some disease process which is causing obstruction to the flow of bile that can start from canaliculi to a extrahepatic duct, means common bile duct, and even can be extending obstruction like a pancreatic mass also. That's what we call as a cholestatic disease. Now it can be a hepatocellular disease, means there can be injury or inflammation of a hepatocytes and that is causing a problem. Or there can be an infiltrative disease, which is there is a cellular infiltrate of any malignant process which is affecting the portal tracts and you are getting abnormality. So we try to see which pattern of liver disease we are dealing with, and then we try to see, okay, what are the diseases which can involve in this pattern, and then we plan our further investigation workup. And to classify these, we use this battery of tests that we just discussed. That is bilirubin, enzymes like SGOT, SGPT, alkaline phosphatase, gamma GTT, and prothrombin time and albumin. Okay, so this table is very important. So on, if you see in the first column, we have all these tests, and in the subsequent columns, they are the pattern of the liver injury. So depending on the degree to which the particular function test is abnormal, we try to divide into a particular pattern. For example, there is a hepatocellular necrosis, like an acute hepatitis. What will happen in that? Because there will be, because of the cellular damage, there will be the death of hepatocytes and there will be release of SGOT and SGPT. So in that, SGOT and SGPT will rise in 500 to thousands. And alkaline phosphatase and GGT will be elevated, but not to that degree. And bilirubin, depending on the degree of the damage, it will go up. So if it is goes, we know that hepatocellular necrosis is there. But suppose apart from that, if your synthetic function is abnormal, if you do an INR and suppose it is prolonged, then we are dealing with liver failure. If your synthetic function are good, then you are dealing with only hepatitis. Now, if your albumin is also decreased, then probably the process might be of a prolonged duration and we may be dealing with a chronic liver disease. That's how we interpret this test. Now, coming to the second column of cholestasis. Here, what will happen, as we just discussed, that there will be obstruction to the biliary flow, which can start from bile canaliculi to extrahepatic bile duct. So, in that, mainly because there is obstruction, the alkaline phosphatase and GGT, which are there in the cholangiocytes, will elevate it to 3 to 4 times of the normal range. So, if you are getting that kind of thing and SGOT, SGPT not that high, but your bilirubin along with that bilirubin is also high, then probably we are dealing with some obstruction. And here, generally, because there is a obstruction to the bile flow, you will be getting a vitamin K deficiency, and that will be responsive to the vitamin K administration. So you know that, okay, synthetic function are good. So when there is obstruction, generally synthetic function remains well preserved and or get deranged at the end of the disease process, not in the initial period of the disease. Your albumin is also normal. So this pattern of injury is a cholestasis. We will come to the cases and we will again come to this, we'll use this table to interpret it. Similarly, this is an infiltrative pattern where you are getting mainly alkaline phosphatase and GGT very high and others are not that elevated, like SGOT, SGPT, bilirubin. Here your INR is also good, albumin is also normal. Here we will get more mainly hepatomegaly. So this is an infiltrative disorder. Okay. So apart from that, all these things, all these liver function test components, they are not liver specific, they are non-specific. So you should also know the non-hepatic causes of derangement of albumin, alkaline phosphatase, SGOT, bilirubin, GGT, and PT-INR. Actually, this is just summary of that, and we have already discussed in the previous slides when we are focusing on individual tests. So now let's see a few cases. So here there is a 1-month-old boy, and he had basically has persistent jaundice. His yellow eyes had light yellow colored urine and pigmented stool. Child is stable. There's no anemia, no convulsion, no fever, no hepatosplenomegaly, no ascites. The child was requiring phototherapy, so you know that unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia. Bilirubin was quite high. That was this range was before child receiving phototherapy. Other components of liver function test are here normal. SGOT, SGPT, synthetic function is normal, and your HB is good. So there is no ongoing hemolysis. Peripheral smear was normal, ultrasound was normal, and you can see we have collected the urine. It's quite clear. So you know that is this is basically an unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia in a child which has a prolonged jaundice. So now coming to this table, when we approach the jaundice, so we are dealing with this part where we have an increased unconjugated jaundice. It can be an overproduction or impaired conjugation. So your hemoglobin is stable, so there is no overproduction, no bleeding, no anemia. So probably we are dealing with the child who has an impaired conjugation. So isolated increase in unconjugated bilirubin that can be in Crigler-Najjar 1, Crigler-Najjar 2, Gilbert syndrome, and breast milk jaundice. And if we are getting isolated elevation of conjugated fraction, then we think of syndromes like Dubin-Johnson and Rota. They are quite rare. We are not that commonly seen. And we are getting suppose elevation even if unconjugated one and along with other LFT derangement, then we might be dealing with parenchymal injury or cholestasis. So here in the index case, it was basically isolated increase in unconjugated one. That's was very high. So this child has basically a Crigler-Najjar syndrome, which was confirmed on genetic analysis. And this child was continued on home phototherapy. And later, once he became around 8 or 9 months of age, he underwent liver transplant. And this is now his picture after 3 years of liver transplant, and he's quite healthy, stable, and he's enjoying his life now. The second case here, we have a 7-year-old boy who had a fever for 2 days. He has a yellow sclera and urine. There was a history of his routinely used to eat outside food. On examination, there is no encephalopathy. Liver was 3 centimeter firm and spleen was not palpable. If you see the bilirubin was elevated and conjugated fraction was high. So it was 7.2 by 4.7. Your albumin is good. Now, AST and ALT both were quite significantly elevated. They are more than 10 times the normal range. And here ALT is more than AST. And alkaline phosphatase and GGT are also elevated, but not to the extent the way the AST, ALT, which are 10 times the normal range. So what we say that, okay, ALT is more than AST, so it might be an acute injury. In this case, so if we're coming to this, so we know that this is basically looks like an intrahepatic cause because the stool color is normal. Now we're coming to this table. So now we know that AST, ALT are elevated, bilirubin mildly elevated, and his synthetic function are good, and albumin was normal. So we are dealing. So that this kind of scenario you get in liver cell injury like acute hepatitis. It can be autoimmune hepatitis. Wilson disease if AST was more than ALT, but here ALT was more than ALT. But yes, Wilson disease can also be a differential diagnosis in this kind of presentation, and drug-induced hepatitis. So that's how this table helps us. So so after 3 days, what happened that SGOT and SGPT went in, so that went so high it goes in 1,000. So does it mean that child is going in liver failure? Don't know. So how we define the liver failure in children is we need to document that liver-based coagulopathy. So the definition for that is your INR should be more than 1.5 and hepatic encephalopathy should be present. Then we call it as there is a liver failure, or irrespective of encephalopathy, if your INR is more than 2, then we call it as a liver failure, and your duration should be less than 8 weeks. So and there should be no known evidence of a liver disease. So coming back to this table again, so if you are getting a prolonged INR, we are dealing with a liver cell failure. It can be an acute liver failure, or it can be decompensated liver disease as well, depending on the clinical context. So now let's see in another case. Here we have a 7-year boy who had bilirubin mild elevation less than 5, AST more than ALT, that almost 10 times, 8 to 10 times elevation. Alkaline phosphatase is mildly elevated. GGT and INR was not done. Liver was palpable and the bilirubin decreased. So means everyone was happy that jaundice is cleared. But after 6 weeks of gap, again he has a very deep jaundice and he has encephalopathy. Now, if here if you see that bilirubin is quite high and AST and ALT are still high, AST more than ALT, so that's what it might be a part of a chronic liver disease. And here when they did INR was prolonged, that was 3.3. So that's the importance of INR. So here basically this child has definitely a synthetic dysfunction, and this child has a Wilson disease, which was confirmed by labs related to Wilson disease. And then this child underwent a liver transplant, and you can see that this is a very nice macro nodular and micronodular cirrhosis of a Wilson disease. So now coming to the next case, here we have an 8-year-old boy born of non-consanguineous marriage, and this child has for 6 months he has a pruritus. From 6 months of life, this child has a pruritus. On the labs, this child has a conjugated jaundice, which kept on fluctuating. Stool was pigmented. This child has a growth retardation, and on examination, this child has a 3 centimeter firm spleen, liver, and 2 centimeter spleen. If you see liver function test, as a bilirubin was elevated, conjugated fraction was increased, synthetic functions were good, SGOT, SGPT was elevated around 7 to 8 times. Alkaline phosphatase and GGT are very, now here you can see GGT was 620, so it is more than 10 times elevated, and INR was 2.6, but after giving vitamin K, INR normalized. So coming to this table again, so we have very high alkaline phosphatase GGT, bilirubin modest elevation, PT INR prolonged, but after vitamin K normalized. So we are dealing with the cholestasis, and mostly intrahepatic cholestasis because the stool color is normal. So we are dealing with a child who have either sclerosing cholangitis, might be cystic fibrosis or Alagille syndrome. So these are the possibilities that can be kept in this child. So this is the picture of this child. You can see this child has a typical triangular faces. He has a bulbous tip of nose. He has a broad breech, and he has basically multiple xanthomas, which is not clearly seen in this picture. And this child has a butterfly vertebrae over here. So this child has a Alagille syndrome. Now case 5. So here we have a 2-year-old boy who had a jaundice with yellow urine. He was not growing well. Child has mild fever, painless ear discharge intermittently, and child has dandruff, and there was a firm hepatosplenomegaly. Liver function shows mild elevation of bilirubin, conjugated type, AST, ALT 2 times elevated, but again alkaline phosphatase and GGT was very high, and here INR was normal. It was 1.1. Alkaline and albumin was normal. So this is, if you see the third column of our table, it shows very high GGT and normal synthetic function. So here we are dealing with infiltrative disorders. The typical infiltrative disorders in the children are tuberculosis, lymphomas, and storage diseases, or inflammatory Langerhans cell histiocytosis, infiltrative disorders kind of thing. Okay. So this child has basically a punch out ulcers in the frontal bone and seborrheic dermatitis. Here we can clearly see the punch out lesion in the skull. So this child has a Langerhans cell histiocytosis, and a nicely done liver function test can give us a clue to it. Now the next case, where we have a 4-month-old boy. Here the 2 months of fever with pale stool, was admitted, received antibiotics, and it improved, but their child has a persistent hepatosplenomegaly, and USG reported was normal. That was a little bit strange. But bilirubin, if you say mild elevation, now if you see here also the alkaline phosphatase and GGTs are very high, but compared to the previous case, the difference is the stool color is pale. We are thinking of a biliary obstruction over here. So this is again, of course, this is a cholestasis. Everything fits in the cholestasis. But as here the stool are pale, we are thinking of a CBD obstruction. And ultrasound was normal. We sometimes it can be depending on how well the interpreter is and how much a baby has cooperated during the ultrasound, because it being a subjective imaging, Sometimes it can be wrong. So we did MRCP, and MRCP basically showed a type 1 colorectal cyst. Of course, this child was later on operated for the same. So in LFT neonatal cholestasis, so again here also, as in the adult, in the elder age group, none of the LFT is specific for diagnosis of neonatal cholestasis. Conjugated versus unconjugated, you need to ask clinically also. The pale stool and the urine color or diaper staining is important. If INR is deranged, probably you are dealing with metabolic causes and neonatal failure. If your GGT is very high, think of biliary atresia and colorectal cyst, like the previous case. If GGT is normal, think of PFIC and bile acid synthetic disorders. So take home message, LFT indicates pattern of disease and not the etiology. LFT should be always interpreted in the context of clinical scenario. When we are dealing with the patient and you know that bilirubin is quite high or jaundice is there, at least once complete LFT should be ordered, and then we can monitor and select which components of liver function test we can use to monitor the patient. And serial LFTs tell us about the prognostication, and once we are following the child, always document the normal LFT. The way we have one child where he improved, so the child was not monitored and later on he presented with the liver failure. So do document normal LFT and normalization of organomegaly to say that, okay, the child has recovered. Thank you.
Thank you, Vibhor sir, for making it easy for general pediatrician to understand LFTs better. Now I request Dr. Ajay Kohli sir to conduct the question answer session. All those who have any queries or questions can ask in the inbox or they can directly ask.
Yeah, I think Ajay Kohli isn't here, sir. Sir, I have Dr. Biani sir. I have one question, sir. This it was a wonderful presentation, and all SOS does not mean doom actually. So it depends on the biology of the tumor. Sir, I have this question. You said about neuronavigation, sir. So
Yeah.
do you actually do electrical potentials while going in for the search, while going into the brain, sir?
दीपक मैं फोन कर हेलो
हाँ sir.
हाँ आप क्या पूछ रहे थे
Neuronavigation, sir. Neuronavigation you mentioned.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask whether you actually evoke those, monitor the potentials while going into the
Those are
brain
two
or
different
how?
things actually. Neuronavigation is for the craniotomy and extent of the resection and how we can preserve the eloquent areas of the brain. Okay, what you are talking is a intraop electrocorticography that is used only in the epilepsy surgery actually. So now today what we are talking is all neuro-oncology, where we want to take out the tumor maximally, safely, without causing any added up damage. Now the problem that comes is suppose it's in the pons or suppose it's in the deep seated, where we don't know, how to get into the brain, where even 1 millimeter or 2 millimeter of margin of error is disastrous consequences actually. Now there are people who would do that without neuronavigation also. But when we have the best of the best facilities, I think that we should offer to all our children actually.
Okay, sir. And the approach remains the same through Burwell or through cribriform plate also can be done?
No,
operation.
What few cases that I showed you, one case that I showed you, neuronavigation, was only a burhole biopsy. So we make a burhole on the skull and then get into the brain. What you are trying to tell me is that now with the latest and advances in neuroendoscopy, now a lot of the lesions like CSF rhinorrhea and pituitary tumors, we can access through the nose actually, and from the sphenoid sinus and frontal sinus actually. So that is another thing, but since we were today talking only on the neuro-oncology, I didn't want to get into the unwanted topics. But yes, lot of things are advanced actually.
Thank you, sir. I request everyone to put their video on, please.
Pardon, ma'am?
No, I'm requesting everyone to put their videos on, sir.
Yeah.
Actually, that neuronavigation was like roaming in the wonderland. It was all new and technologically so much advanced. Wonderful.
No, ma'am. Actually, no, it's not that way. Like when I went for fellowship in 2004 in Israel, I passed out from Bombay Hospital. That was one of the best teaching institutes for neuro. And when I went to Israel, in 2004, there at Israel Tel Aviv Medical Center, they've had 3 types of neuronavigation system actually.
Oh, great.
World's first intraop MRI was installed in Tel Aviv Medical Center actually. So we think that we are rudimentary, but it's not like that. In India also, probably for past 15 years, we have neuronavigation system actually.
Right.
So this is not something that is not there. The problem comes is that suppose XYZ hospital doesn't have a neuronavigation system, then the neurosurgeon would not offer that high-end technology to his patient.
Yes.
But it doesn't mean that the work is not being done. Still, the tumors are operated in all the major centers actually. What happens is that this neuronavigation, these things, it becomes very flashy.
Right.
In fact, today I have operated a child of thalamic glioma at SRCC with neuronavigation. I used to put a lot of these things in our IIP group WhatsApp forum.
Yeah.
Got bored actually. I should start that actually once in a week.
Yeah. Once in a while, actually, we should read because it takes a lot of time to see in WhatsApp. थोड़ा देर लगता है. तो सब
मेरे लिए ऐसा लगता है कि एक पीडियाट्रिशियन साल का एक भी ब्रेन ट्यूमर या कोई भी चीज एक पेशेंट भी डायग्नोस कर दिया तो उसका भी एप्रोप्रिएट ट्रीटमेंट हो गया. आई थिंक दैट इज आल्सो अ बिग थिंग फॉर द चाइल्ड.
ट्रू. राइट.
No, the point that
आज 20 केसेस दिखाए, इसका मतलब ये नहीं कि कल आपके ओपीडी में जो हेडेक आएंगे सब ब्रेन ट्यूमर्स फिर रहेंगे.
True.
No, the point, Dr. Naresh, the point is, how does the neuronavigation is done? What is how it is done? What is neuronavigation actually? How it is done?
अभी आपने सियोटैक्टिक बायोप्सी सुना है? So what previously we used to do is that we used to put a stereotactic frame and then get a CT scan and then do a Burwell biopsy. Okay, ma'am. So now what we are doing is that this is a frameless stereotactic. So basically, pre-operatively we get an MRI done. Then that MRI pictures are loaded into the computer, and we get a navigation protocol studies done. And once the protocol is done, then exactly we know how much craniotomy has to be done. 5 centimeter anterior to the coronal suture, 2 centimeter posterior to the coronal suture, instead of doing with the surface marking or going by a randomly. What would happen is that suppose the 5 centimeter into 5 centimeter craniotomy is needed, and if somebody does 8 into 8 craniotomy also, centimeter into centimeter, that is not crime, but that is not needed. This is not an recent advances. It's something like that actually.
Right.
I would put it as simple as neuronavigation as a Google map.
Right.
आज पहले अपने को किधर जाना है, आज मेरे को अंधेरी किधर जाना है, रास्ता पूछ के जाना है, आज सीधा गूगल मैप में डालना है, मेरे को इधर उधर देखना ही नहीं. It is just a navigation.
Accuracy will be enhanced.
Hello.
Yes sir.
सर ये रोबोटिक सर्जरी और नेविगेशन सर्जरी सेम है कि कुछ अलग है?
नहीं. Robotic is different. Robotic is what impression we get is that if the robotic surgery is done, it would be done autonomously. It is not like that. Robot ke behind me, it is the man only sitting behind the machine actually.
Yes.
Okay.
So robotic surgery, what we will call as, it is minimally invasive.
Okay.
But then there is a man or a surgeon who is controlling the computer and the robot.
Okay.
Now robotic surgeries have advanced. Basically, it started with the prostate cancer, where they wanted to spare the nerve-sparing prostate resection. Then again, it has come into a lot of urogynec oncology work, and since it's a very expensive gadget actually, so once the hospital buys that, then they want to market it. Like they would say, okay, we are doing this with also with the robotic and that also with robotic. But it is not that all the surgeries have to be done by a robotic surgery or a latest advancement. There are certain indications, and we have to appropriately pick and choose actually.
Another question is very basic. We know the posterior fossa tumors, they present early, right? Due to raised ICT, right? What about where is the anterior fontanelle is open and that in infantile or 18 months or maybe up to 20 months? Whether the same they present early or somewhat different, which is presentation wise.
That is
clinical presentation, I'm saying.
Yeah, we are mixing two things actually, sir. So posterior fossa is a very tight compartment. Okay. And it contains fourth ventricle. So suppose you have a tight compartment with an SOL, they would present in two ways. It is the space occupation of the fourth ventricle, or symptoms of medulla or cerebellum, or earlier presentation is why, because it obstructs the hydrocephalus, it obstructs the CSF pathways and causes hydrocephalus. And that is how they present with vomiting, raised ICT, six-nerve palsy, and all those stuff.
Right.
Now, having open frontale or not having open frontale is nothing to do with the symptomatology. If the child, usually the frontale closes by around 12 to 14 months. If the frontale is open, then it's a blessing in disguise to see the raised pressure. But posterior fossa would miss a typical presentation that I would see, or I would let the pediatrician know, is that is a preschool going child, 7 years, 6 years old child, presents with a severe headache in the morning, and it relieves with the vomiting. Then he goes to the school, comes back again, same day, next day again it has the same story. He wakes up with a severe headache, vomiting, and it resolves. If you have this type of thing, first thing is to get a fundoscopy done and a straight neuroimaging.
Okay.
So we have red flags actually. We have Mahesh also with us. Probably I would put that, red flags, when we have to seriously think the abnormality. As a pediatrician, probably you are seeing hundreds of headaches and other things, and you get an MRI done thinking that, अरे नरेश का आज presentation देख लिया, कल तो brain tumor निकलेगा ही, पर निकलता नहीं. It's quite rare.
Sir, one odd presentation commonly we see is acquired torticollis.
Exactly. Torticollis is seen typically in ependymoma,
Right.
where it comes out of the foramen of Luschka and causes irritation of the 11th nerve. Actually,
Biani
That's
sir,
very common.
another what I feel is the early diagnosis possible because available to the MRI. अभी ऐसा हो गया MRI हॉस्पिटल के आजू बाजू में 2, 4, 5, 10 जगह अवेलेबल है तो इजीली हो जाता है. Is that is a position that we're able to diagnose the tumors more early? One of the important factor.
correct, sir. Neuroimaging has been a big boon actually, sir. Big boon. And imagine, like in 1980s and maybe in 70s, there was no neuroimaging. What they would do is a carotid angiogram and a pneumoencephalogram, and वो ऐसा है कि तुक्का है, लग गया तो लग गया, नहीं लग गया तो लग गया. So
Right.
I think we should appreciate the neurosurgeons of that era and how they manage the patients. We are very, very lucky to have all these modern gadgets and helping us things.
Yeah. Thank you.
Dr. Bivar sir, we are hearing a lot of liver transplantation and these things. Actually, as a general pediatrician while practicing, when we should think that this has to be gone for regarding liver transplantation?
So when we are basically, as if we are discussing LFT, that's a very basic topic. And so basically this can be linked to probably any problem in the liver. In the getting more than 1.5, and we do not have an etiology, so it is an untreated liver disease. So definitely, so no liver disease will remain the same. Either it will basically improve or deteriorate. So any deteriorating liver disease with unknown etiology will generally go down. So or acute liver failure when your INR is going more than 4. So these are the scenarios where we think of when we know that probably medical management.
Hello.
We have lost the link. Till that sir arrives, Dr. Biani sir, if we do unindicated MRI, whether it is a chance of giving rise to radiation hazards. Unmute yourself.
Sorry.
Dr. Naresh sir, unmute कीजिए. Dr. Bivar sir, we have asked one question to Dr. Naresh.
No, I didn't get your question, sir.
No, if we are doing unindicated MRIs and whether these unindicated MRIs may be the cause for radiation hazards.
No. We are mixing up too many things actually.
Yes.
CT scan has an ionizing radiation. So multiple CT scan would cause radiation hazard. MRI is not a ionizing. No, it's a magnetic
Okay.
technology. So you can do n number of MRI without having a risk of a cancer developing due to the radiation. In fact, MRIs are safe. That we do fetal MRIs also. So it doesn't cause any problem actually.
Yes,
Multiple
sir.
stages can be an etiology for a further radiation hazard and oncological tumors developing.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Dr. Vivor, sir, you can continue.
Yeah. So what I was discussing was advanced liver disease with unknown etiology. Advanced liver disease, known etiology, but now it's beyond the margin where we can treat him. That in infants like biliary atresia, if they're presented late, timely presented biliary atresia with failed liver Kasai portoenterostomy, unknown metabolic. So these will be the indications for a liver transplant in pediatric age groups. Now, now recently I started this liver transplant at SRCC, and till now we have done 5 liver transplant. Of that, mainly we have 2 of liver failure, 1 of Wilson disease, 1 of biliary atresia, 1 of PFIC. So gradually, even the youngest we have done of 8 kg. So we have both ALFs and decompensated liver disease, which has undergone and required liver transplants.
Right.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir.
Any more questions? Anyone has any more questions? Okay, Manju, go ahead.
Yes.
Before Madam speaks, SRCC, I see Mr. Manmohan is there. You want to speak any, Manmohan?
No, sir.
You want to say a few words on behalf of SRCC?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for giving the opportunity for this webinar, and thank you so much, sir. That's what, sir.
Thank you, sir. I think we have come toward the end of this beautiful session. Now I request Dr. Sanjeevani Madam to end the session with the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Manju. On the behalf of IIP Raigad, I take opportunity to thank today's eminent speaker, Dr. Naresh Bayani sir and Vibhor Borkar sir for their excellent presentation. I thank respected Dr. Mohite sir, President Madam Ingre, and President Madam, Secretary Madam Bhandarkar Madam for arranging such a nice session. I thank SRCC team for being with us. I thank respected Dabadkar sir, Mohanty sir, Gangulia sir, Dr. Jay Bhandarkar sir, Dr. Wankhede sir, Dr. Chitra Kulkarni ma'am, respected senior colleagues and dear friends for attending the session and for your valuable inputs. Thank you so much.